It's July 24th, 1797. We're at Santa Cruz de Tenerife, where Admiral Horatio Nelson is about to give a sterling lesson in leading by example. As the British force storms the harbour at Santa Cruz, Nelson and his men are struck by a sweeping burst of grape shot. The results are devastating. Men are quite literally torn open where they stand. Captain Richard Bowen is cut down along with several under his command. He dies in absolute agony, along with his men. And their commander, Nelson, has been struck too, and it's a bad one. The Admiral's right arm is completely shattered. Blood gushes from the wound as his stepson, Lieutenant Nisbet, attempts to stem the bleeding. Badly wounded, but alive and alert, Nelson is bundled into a rowing boat and taken back to the flagship. Back on board, the surgeon Thomas Eshelby prepares his tools. Despite the blood loss, Nelson is still lucid. He gestures to his mangled arm and gives his command to Eshelby. "Doctor, I want to get rid of this useless piece of flesh here." Eshelby does as he's told. As the men hold the writhing Nelson down, the surgeon saws through the Admiral's arm above the elbow. Like so many of his men, Nelson is experiencing surgery aboard a Royal Navy ship. If it's good enough for them, it's good enough for him too. The impromptu medical operation is a success. Nelson lives to fight another day, minus his arm, which is tossed unceremoniously overboard. The military operation, however, is not a success. The Royal Navy will lose this battle, along with 250 sailors and one arm. But we're not here to talk about battles today. We're also not really here to talk about Nelson, at least not much. Instead, we're looking at something that the old Admiral was well versed in: Royal Navy medicine. This is the sometimes ingenious, sometimes baffling, almost always downright insane history of medicine in Nelson's Navy. But first, a quick word from our sponsor. You see, while we're on the topic of the high seas, it's often said that sailors kept themselves scurvy-free and mentally sane by drinking lots and lots of grog. That's rum, mixed with citrus and water. Now, although this might be a recipe for a good old time, it's also a fantastic way to end up feeling awful the day after. And that's no fun, either back then or today in the modern world. That's why I've partnered with ZBiotics Pre-Alcohol Probiotic, invented by PhD scientists to help you get over those nasty mornings after a few too many down the boozer. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol produces a toxic byproduct in your gut called acetaldehyde. And it's actually the acetaldehyde that makes you feel lousy the next day, not the dehydration. But if you make pre-alcohol your first drink of the night, enjoy responsibly, then that acetaldehyde is less of a problem. Check out my link in the description, zbiotics.com/flashback15 to get 15% off your first order. Again, that's zbiotics.com/flashback15. Thank you to ZBiotics for sponsoring this video, and thank you, the viewer, for not skipping the ad. With that, let's get back to medicine in Nelson's Navy. Life was tough on a Royal Navy ship. For essayist and dictionarian Samuel Johnson, being on a ship is being in jail, with the possibility of being drowned. Samuel Johnson was never in the Navy, and he wasn't exactly known for his sunny outlook, but he wasn't really wrong here either. Disease was rife on Navy ships, sailors were just a small mishap away from a crippling injury, and in times of war, there was an enemy just waiting to blow you up, drown you, slash you to pieces, or, if they're lucky, all of the above. And if you happen to survive any of these calamities, you might find yourself facing an even worse fate: the surgeon's knife. So, if you were a Royal Navy sailor, it was very much in your interest to stay healthy. The best form of treatment was not to be treated at all. And to be fair, the ship's quartermaster did a fairly good job of making this happen. Rather than the gruel and hardtack that we often associate with life on the open waves, diets were actually pretty good on board Navy ships, and certainly better than they were in Wellington's land armies. With daily rations of beer and beef and pork available several times a week, sailors would have had plenty to sustain them. But while the diet might have kept sailors reasonably strong, it didn't necessarily keep them healthy. The causes of disease like scurvy weren't understood until the mid-18th century, and regular fruit and vegetable rations weren't made available until 1795. Sailors could get hold of exotic fruits in foreign ports. As one sailor explained, they could find things like pomegranates, which are the size of oranges, much about the colour of mellow apples, but inside something like that of gooseberries. But this fresh fruit wouldn't keep, so sailors couldn't eat it regularly. The men would still get scurvy if they were away from land for an extended period of time, and getting scurvy was no joke. A 16th century account from a naval surgeon describes the grim treatments he applied to himself after coming down with the disease. It rotted all my gums, which gave out a black and putrid blood. My thighs and lower legs were black and gangrenous, and I was forced to use my knife each day to cut into the flesh in order to release this black and foul blood. I also used my knife on my gums, which were livid and growing over my teeth. When I had cut away this dead flesh and caused much black blood to flow, I rinsed my mouth and teeth with my urine, rubbing them very hard. It wasn't until the days of James Lind in the mid-18th century that doctors understood the role of vitamin C in preventing scurvy. And it was still another 50 years before the Royal Navy began issuing fruit and fruit juice rations. This meant there was a lot more cutting of gangrenous flesh and shedding of putrid blood before these rations were issued, and plenty more preventable deaths. So, sailors largely had to rely on fruit from foreign ports to keep scurvy away, but in some cases, the fruit might actively make a sailor sick. A man named Mr. Odie served as the mastermate on a ship called the Arab. In Barbados, he ate what was described as a mangarine apple, which sent him into a fit of vomiting and violent convulsion. Odie was prescribed a good quantity of sweet oil, a warm bath, and a calomel purge. A calomel purge literally meant ingesting mercury chloride to purge the insides, and this would have been severely uncomfortable for Odie, causing stomach cramps and bloody diarrhea. It could, of course, being mercury, be fatal in some cases, but it seems that Odie survived, as the ship's doctor pessimistically noted, quote, "The effect of this poison is never properly eradicated." Whether the poison he's referring to is the apple or the mercury chloride, we don't know. But as well as diet, the other key aspect to keeping men healthy was hygiene. However, things like washing with soap and carrying out basic personal care tasks weren't enforced until the late 18th century. A cook's mate drew attention to the offensive smell of the sheets at a naval hospital in 1797. It was only after repeated complaints and a fatal outbreak of smallpox that the sheets were actually changed. As for soap, naval officials weren't sure it was worth the cost. It wasn't until they realised that losing men to illness was 10 times more expensive than just giving them some soap that such personal items were issued, although it was all deducted from pay, of course. So the Navy did try to keep men healthy, it's just that they often didn't quite succeed. As you might expect, illness was rife on ships in Nelson's Navy. Being in close proximity with your fellow sailors meant it was easy to get sick, and if you got sick, it meant you had to be treated. Fever was common on ships, and this would be treated by, quote, bleeding, purging, and giving cooling febrifuges. A febrifuge is basically a medicine designed to reduce body temperature. Bleeding was viewed as a sort of miracle cure among the Navy's doctors. William Northcote advised in 1776, "Where the wounded person has not suffered any great loss of blood, it will be advisable to open a vein immediately and take from the arm a very large quantity, and to repeat bleeding, as circumstances may require, the second and even the third day. This timely precaution will prevent a good deal of pain and inflammation." Bleeding was also a common treatment for typhus. Typhus was a real problem in 18th century navies, mainly because of how it spread. It was the droppings of infected lice that spread typhus, and there were plenty of these lice on board ships. But for the doctors of the day, the disease was a mystery. Physicians like Archibald Menzies and James Carmichael Smith believed that typhus was carried on the human breath, so they elected to fumigate and purify the air around the patient. To do this, they would vaporize nitrous acid and then fumigate a room with a mist of the chemical. Often the patient himself would be fumigated too. It's possible that this blast of acid killed the typhus-carrying lice, but it wouldn't have offered any kind of cure. Oh well, let's remember they could always bleed the patient a bit more. By the early 1800s, it seems that the obsession with bleeding had begun to fade, though, and instead, ship surgeons only took blood from those who actively requested it. John Scholl was a foreign-born sailor serving on the HMS London in 1800 when he came down with catarrhal fever. He'd served in places like Hanover and Prussia, where medical bleeding was still practiced. At his request, 10 ounces of blood were taken from his arm. The doctor noted that, quote, "It is a common request among the foreigners on board here." For physician John Woodall, though, the main cause of disease wasn't filth-ridden food, exposure to foreign ailments your body wasn't prepared for, or a lack of fruit and veg. Instead, it was sin. In Woodall's view, the men just weren't godly enough. The sailors were prone to temptation and fornication, which meant God would cast his judgment down upon them. In a way, he was right, although it wasn't God handing down the nasty sentences. Instead, it was the tiny bacteria of Neisseria gonorrhea and Treponema pallidum that cast the final judgment. That's gonorrhea and syphilis to you and me. And this was a real problem. Sailors arriving in port would often flock to the nearest brothel, and as education on sexual hygiene was pretty lacking, they'd often come down with something nasty. For syphilis, mercury was the chosen cure. Able seaman Jason Darling began feeling pretty unwell while serving on the HMS Albion, and when questioned, he admitted to seeing a girl 10 days earlier in port. He was given a mercury-based ointment, which would have exposed him to dangerous levels of the chemical, as in large doses, mercury poisoning causes brain damage and organ failure. He was also given lunar caustic, which was said to cure the French pox. Lunar caustic is essentially silver nitrate. It's supposed to corrode and chafe against infected tissue, removing it and curing the infection. It would not, of course, have cured the infection and would have instead simply caused painful abrasions as it scraped against the sores and ulcers on the man's groin. If nothing else, these bizarre treatments likely taught Darling a valuable lesson. He'd be more careful on his next trip to the brothel. But for all the smallpox and yellow fever and the typhus and clap, the biggest killer upon Royal Navy ships in the late 18th century was something else entirely. It was tuberculosis, or TB. For this, the treatment was, well, surprisingly gentle. Yes, there was a bit of bloodletting, there was always bloodletting, but for the most part, you'd be prescribed plenty of fresh air and a nice bit of bed rest. This probably sounded just fine for overworked sailors, except, of course, usually it wasn't fine. The disease was fatal in most cases. You might get excused from your normal duties, but there was a good chance you were going to die. Doctors believe fumigation could prevent diseases like tuberculosis. They'd take a tub of sand, heat it to a great temperature, and then pour sulfuric acid and powder of nitrate upon it. This would create a sort of hissing gas that would creep through the space and get rid of the TB. It's not clear how effective this was, or if doctors even believed it would be effective at all. Henry Kelsall was the surgeon on the HMS Juliana. He believed fumigation was a good way to clear lazy sailors out of their quarters, ready for cleaning. In Kelsall's own words, this involved closing the hatches and smoking them up with fumes of sulphur, cayenne pepper, etc. At least cleaning the quarters would maybe have helped keep sailors healthy. But even if you take disease completely out of the equation, there were plenty of other opportunities for a medical emergency on one of Nelson's ships. One account focuses on Michael Chris, a sailor aged 28 years old. While moving between decks, Chris lost his balance and took a nasty tumble. He, quote, landed heavily on his perineum. As you might expect, this seems to have caused young Michael some discomfort. His scrotum swelled up to a terrifying size and had begun to ulcerate by the time he went before the ship's surgeon. Fortunately for Michael, the treatment was relatively benign. Poultices were applied to the ulcers, and a scrotal support was used to immobilize his swollen testicles. He then rested up in a hammock and presumably made a full recovery. The case of Michael Chris is fairly bizarre, but it does give a good indication of how ship surgeons dealt with injuries. On a busy ship, with lots of movement back and forth, injuries like broken bones and hernias were fairly common, and these would typically be treated the same way. There would be a poultice applied to reduce inflammation and prevent infection, and then the afflicted area would be immobilized with a splint. For internal injuries like hernias, there wasn't much they could do. They'd simply tell you to rest up. This is what Thomas Eshelby told Nelson when he suffered an abdominal hernia at the Battle of Cape Vincent in 1797. It doesn't seem like Nelson took too much notice of him. But what if the injury was really severe? What if you had a compound fracture with the bone protruding through the skin? Well, you better say goodbye to that limb because amputation was the only option. To understand what surgery would have been like on board Nelson's ships, we need to take a look at the surgeon's chest. By the early 18th century, these chests were mandatory on Navy ships. They provided all the tools required for the surgeon to do his job. According to Royal Navy regulations published in 1731, they would be thoroughly examined and locked, and they would carry, quote, the seals of the physician and of the surgeons. This sounds quite thorough and systematic. It might even give you confidence that you're in good hands, but wait till you see what's inside. A manifest from 1812 tells us that the surgeon's chest would have included the following: amputating equipment, such as amputating knives and bone saws, plus a metacarpal saw, like a small hacksaw, for conducting fiddly sawing jobs. These saws would typically be heated before they were used, but this wasn't to prevent infection. It was done because it was believed that a cold saw was just too painful. A warm saw would cut through bone and sinew more easily. It is nice to know that how the surgeons were concerned for the comfort and welfare of their patients. There were also double-bladed Catlin incision knives in the surgeon's chest, plus curved needles, as well as a bone nipper and a turn screw. Screw tourniquets, tenaculums, and artery forceps would be used to stem the massive amounts of bleeding from surgery. There were also pieces of probing equipment which were earmarked for minor procedures. These included bullet forceps, bullet and musket ball scoops, razors, needles, and scalpels. There would also be probangs too, sprung implements for removing obstructions in the esophagus. The chest would also include trocars, or small taps designed for draining fluid. There would also be silver catheters and gum elastic catheters. In the dentistry section, there would be a key tooth instrument, a gum lancet, some tooth forceps, and a small punch for making holes in the tissue around the jaw. Filed under miscellaneous, there would be syringes, leg splints, tourniquets, and fortunately, plenty of bandages. Also in the miscellaneous section is the vaguely named apparatus for restoring suspended animation, which basically means reviving someone who has fallen unconscious. The manual is vague about this because it was carried out in different ways. One of the best documented methods was the use of tobacco smoke. Surgical teams would quite literally blow smoke up the patient's rear end using a pipe and bellows. This may sound made up, but it was used, and many people said it was highly effective. On the HMS Princess Royal in 1802, a surgeon claimed he brought a drowned man back to life with this method. I'd argue that if you can be revived with a puff of smoke up your rear, then you probably weren't drowned in the first place. Brandy enemas, ammonia-based smelling salts, and even the injection of lethal poisons like strychnine were also documented. The patient may also have had their lungs inflated with a bellows, or have their arms and legs moved backwards and forwards to encourage resumption of breathing. The bellows may have actually worked in some cases, but with all the other methods it was just plain luck whether you'd live or die. All of this adds up to a pretty horrifying array of equipment that a naval surgeon could use. But we're forgetting something. There's one more category on that manifest from 1812. Trephination. The trunk would include 3 trephines. These looked something like a corkscrew that you might use to open a bottle of wine, but they were designed to actually bore a circular hole directly into the head. They would also have a standard saw used for the difficult task of cutting lengthways into the bone. There would be rougens too, files and rasps designed to scrape away at the connective tissue that would have covered the surface of the bone. Known as periosteum, this connective tissue had a habit of getting in the way while surgeons bludgeoned their way into your head. Other trephination equipment includes an elevator for separating bone and tissue, as well as forceps and a brush. Trephination is an interesting one. We often associate this method with the archaic ideas of medieval surgery, opening up a hole to let evil spirits leave the head. But actually this is wrong. The older methods are not trephining, but trepanning. The more modern trephining process was designed to be more precise. It also used a cone-shaped cutting head, so it was easier to remove the disc of bone once it was cut from the skull. There was actually some medical justification to this method too. Conditions like brain bleeds can put a lot of pressure on the brain itself as the build-up of fluid squeezes the organ within the skull. Opening up the skull and releasing some of this pressure actually might work in some cases, although there is a good chance that it will also kill you. There are lots of manuals on trephining from the period simply because the risk of death was so high if the surgeon didn't know exactly what they were doing. Up to now, we've been pretty hard on the doctors and surgeons of the Royal Navy, and it's easy to look back from our comfortable 21st century vantage point and almost giggle at how insane some of these treatments and cures were. But to be fair, real medical breakthroughs emerged from this period. The work of James Lind, Thomas Trotter, and others helped defeat scurvy in the Navy. Later surgeons like Alexander Bryson pushed the understanding of tropical disease forwards, saving countless lives on long voyages. It should also be noted that these guys were working in some tough environments. Surgery would take place on the orlop deck, right in the bowels of the ship. This meant that surgeons were protected from cannon fire during a battle, and from some of the rolls and pitches of the rough seas, but this would still have been an incredibly challenging place in which to perform life-saving surgery. What's amazing is that plenty of amputees and surgical patients did survive. This is surely a testament to the skill of the surgeons themselves. William Betty was the surgeon on the HMS Victory. During the Battle of Trafalgar, he saved 96 of the 102 patients he treated. 11 of these patients needed amputations, and all but 2 of those survived, which is a pretty impressive success rate. Of course, one of the patients who did not survive was Admiral Nelson himself. At around 1:15 on the afternoon of the battle, the Admiral was struck in the shoulder by a musket ball. The shot punctured Nelson's lung and shattered 2 of his vertebrae. As we know, Nelson had been wounded plenty of times before. He'd lost his arm at Santa Cruz and destroyed his eye at Calvi in Corsica. But this time it was different. He just wasn't going to survive this one. Knowing that he was done for, and probably keen to avoid spending his final moments in agonized, futile surgery, Nelson told Beatty, "You can do nothing for me. I have a short time to live. My back is shot through." He died 3 hours later. The Admiral's greatest triumph, and arguably the Royal Navy's greatest ever victory at sea, would cost Nelson his life. Surgeons like Beatty were certainly far better than we often give them credit for, but they weren't miracle workers. Thousands of men died in Nelson's Navy from a myriad of different causes, whether falling down a ladder, shot by an enemy cannon, or succumbing to some nasty disease. In the end, their great leader would lead by example one last time and join them in premature death.